Welcome back to the channel. Hopewell, New Jersey was supposed to be a sanctuary, a sprawling 400-acre estate designed to keep a suffocating world at bay. But on the rain-swept night of March 1st, 1932, it became a tomb of silence. Inside sat Charles Lindbergh, the lone eagle, the man who had famously conquered the infinite Atlantic and mastered the very heavens. He was a global icon, a real-life Superman who seemed untouchable. Yet, as the wind howled outside his fortress, a vicious tragedy was unfolding in the nursery upstairs. There is a haunting paradox here. How does a man who owned the sky, who navigated by the stars alone, fail to protect the one life that mattered most from a simple wooden ladder and a broken window? Tonight, we peel back the layers of fame and fear to re-examine the case files of a tragedy that shattered a nation's soul. To understand why the abduction of a 20-month-old child in 1932 was heralded as the crime of the century, we must first look at the man who made the world believe in gods again. In the late 1920s, the globe didn't have influencers or viral stars in the way we understand them today. It had Charles Lindbergh. To comprehend the sheer, terrifying vulnerability of that nursery in Hopewell, we have to look back to May 1927, to a flight that defied every known law of human endurance and safety. In May 1927, aviation was still a vicious gamble, a playground for daredevils where the price of a single mistake was almost always a gruesome death. Charles Lindbergh was just 25 years old, a lanky, stoic former airmail pilot with a singular, insatiable desire to win the Ortig Prize by flying non-stop from New York to Paris. No one had done it. Several seasoned aviators had already died trying. Lindbergh's vessel, the Spirit of St. Louis, was less of a plane and more of a flying fuel tank. To save every possible ounce of weight, he famously stripped the aircraft of everything that could offer a margin of safety. There was no radio to call for help, no parachute to save his life, and incredibly, no forward windshield. To see where he was going, he had to use a small periscope or tilt the plane to look out the side windows. He navigated by the stars, the compass, and sheer instinct. When he took off from a muddy Roosevelt Field on May 20th, he hadn't slept for 24 hours. What followed was 33.5 hours of pure psychological madness. As he buzzed just 10 feet above the Atlantic waves, the absolute isolation began to play vicious tricks on his mind. He reported seeing ghostly figures in the cockpit, spirits of past aviators who sat beside him in the silence, speaking to him, keeping him awake as his eyelids grew heavy with a weight no human should carry. He was flying 3,600 miles through blinding fog and sleet. His only companion, the rhythmic, hypnotic drone of a single right whirlwind engine. Every time his head slumped, he would force himself awake by sticking his head out the window into the freezing air or holding his eyelids open with his fingers. He stared into the gray Atlantic mist until the hallucinations became more real than the cockpit itself. This wasn't just a flight. It was a transformation. For those 33 hours, Lindbergh existed in a void where the world could not reach him. When he finally spotted the Emerald Coast of Ireland, he was no longer just a pilot. He had become something beyond human in the eyes of the public. He was the lone eagle, a real-life Superman who had conquered the infinite. The grit it took to stay awake while his brain was literally shutting down from exhaustion created a legend that would eventually become his own golden cage. When the Spirit of St. Louis finally touched down at Le Bourget Field in Paris, the world changed in a heartbeat. Lindbergh expected a quiet landing and perhaps a hotel room. Instead, he was met by a tidal wave of 150,000 people. They weren't just cheering, they were hysterical, driven by an insatiable desire to touch the man who had done the impossible. They tore pieces of fabric from his plane as souvenirs. They surged forward with a hunger that was almost frightening, nearly crushing the hero they had come to worship. In that moment, Charles Lindbergh ceased to be a private citizen. He became a piece of global property. The pressure that followed was suffocating, a weight of fame that would break most men. Upon his return to the United States, he was greeted by the largest ticker tape parade in New York City history, where an estimated 4 million people lined the streets just to catch a glimpse of him. He received 3.5 million letters and 100,000 telegrams. The press developed a vicious obsession with every detail of his life: what he ate, what he wore, who he spoke to. He couldn't walk down a street without being mobbed. This was the birth of modern celebrity culture, and Lindbergh hated every second of it. He was a man of silence, precision, and order, thrust into a world of noise, flashbulbs, and chaos. He was a hero who felt like a hunted animal. In 1929, he attempted to reclaim some scrap of a personal life by marrying Anne Morrow, the brilliant and poetic daughter of a wealthy U.S. ambassador. They were the world's first true power couple, followed by photographers at every turn. But for Lindbergh, fame remained a vicious predator. When their first child, Charles Jr., was born in 1930, the obsession only intensified. The media called him the eaglet, as if he were a biological specimen of the lone eagle himself. Photographers would jump out of bushes to snap pictures of the baby in his carriage, and kidnapping threats began to arrive in the mail. It was this gruesome intrusion into their private joy that drove Lindbergh to seek the ultimate escape. He didn't want a mansion on a busy street. He wanted a fortress where the world couldn't find him. The search for privacy led the Lindberghs to the rugged Sauerland Mountains of New Jersey. They purchased 400 acres of secluded, heavily wooded land near the small town of Hopewell. To the public, it looked like a dream of pastoral peace. To Lindbergh, it was a tactical necessity. He commissioned a sprawling French manor-style home that they named Hopewell Estate. It was designed to be a sanctuary, a place so remote and so difficult to access that the unsavory characters of the tabloid press and the obsessed public would be kept at bay. The house was built with thick stone walls and stood in the center of a dense forest, miles from the nearest main road. Lindbergh took a personal, almost obsessive interest in the design and security of the estate, believing that his fame required a level of isolation that bordered on the extreme. The nursery for little Charlie was placed on the second floor, seemingly out of reach of anyone on the ground. But there was a fatal, tragic irony in the design of this fortress. Because the house was still under construction in early 1932, the shutters on the nursery window were warped from the weather and couldn't be bolted shut from the inside. Lindbergh had built a 400-acre cage to keep the world out. But in doing so, he had trapped his family in a location where help was miles away. The Sauerland soil was heavy, muddy, and difficult to track. The estate was so quiet that even a loud noise might be dismissed as a falling branch or a kitchen shelf. He had unknowingly created the perfect environment for a predator to move in the shadows. He believed his intellect and his fortress would protect his son, but he had unwittingly provided a kidnapper with the perfect isolated stage for a vicious crime. The untouchable icon was about to learn that the higher you fly, the more devastating the fall when the ground finally catches up. He owned the sky, but on the night of March 1st, he would find himself powerless on the earth. The night of March 1st, 1932, was never intended to be a night of historical infamy. It began with the rhythmic, mundane sounds of a household settling into the quiet of the Sauerland Mountains. Outside, a vicious storm was brewing, the New Jersey wind howling through the dense woods, whipping rain against the thick stone walls of the Lindbergh estate. Inside, the atmosphere was clinical, almost silent. Charles Lindbergh, a man who valued precision and order above all else, was in his study. His wife, Anne, was recovering from a cold. The center of their universe, 20-month-old Charles Jr., had been tucked into his crib on the second floor. Betty Gow, the family's young Scottish nurse, followed a strict routine. At 7:30 p.m., she had prepared the infant for sleep. She meticulously fastened a thumb guard onto his hand, a small metal device designed to prevent the toddler from sucking his thumb. She dressed him in a one-piece flannel suit, a garment Anne Lindbergh had personally hand-stitched. There was no premonition of danger, only the heavy, insulating silence of a fortress meant to keep the world away. Betty closed the door to the nursery, leaving the child in the dark. For 2.5 hours, that silence remained unbroken. At exactly 10 p.m., Betty returned to the nursery. She didn't turn on the light immediately, moving by instinct through the familiar room. She reached into the crib to check the child's breathing, but her hand met only the cold, flat surface of the mattress. Panic is a slow-growing vine. At first, she thought perhaps Anne had taken the baby. She hurried to Anne's room. "Mrs. Lindbergh, do you have the baby?" The answer was a terrifying no. Betty then descended to the study, her voice trembling. "Colonel Lindbergh, have you the baby?" Charles looked up from his desk, his face a mask of sudden, sharp alertness. He didn't wait for an explanation. He bounded up the stairs, followed by the two women. They stood before the empty crib, the only sound the wind rattling the warped window shutters. Lindbergh's voice, usually as steady as a flight instrument, finally cracked. "Anne," he whispered, the words hanging in the stagnant air. "They have stolen our baby." The investigation that followed would be remembered as a masterclass in forensic frustration. As Lindbergh stood in the nursery, gripping a rifle, he was looking into a void that logic could not fill. The room was a graveyard of missing evidence. The most glaring clue was resting on the windowsill, a plain white envelope. Inside was a ransom note, written in a cramped, distorted hand that hinted at an immigrant's struggle with English. But it wasn't the text that haunted the investigators. It was the signature. At the bottom of the page was a bizarre geometric symbol, 2 overlapping blue circles, a red circle in the center, and 3 holes punched through the paper in a precise triangular pattern. It was a disturbing psychological calling card, a mark of a criminal who wanted to be recognized but never found. On the floor near the window were 2 distinct, muddy footprints. They were blurred, the New Jersey clay refusing to hold a clear shape, yet they pointed toward the exit. Forensic science in 1932 was in its infancy, and the Metropolitan Police had their work cut out for them. They looked for fingerprints, but the surfaces of the nursery were tragically clean. The kidnapper had moved like a ghost. Outside, beneath the window, the true gravity of the crime was leaning against the stone wall. A wooden ladder, built in 3 sections, lay abandoned in the mud. One of the rails had snapped. A clean break that suggested the weight of a man and a child had been too much for the amateurish construction. This was the forensics of the void. A crime scene that provided enough pieces to form a puzzle, but no clear image of the predator who had designed it. There is a moment in the case files that puzzles psychologists to this day. Between 9 o'clock and 9:30 p.m., while Charles Lindbergh was sitting in his study directly below the nursery, he heard a sound. He later described it as the sound of a slat falling off a crate or a shelf breaking in the kitchen. It was a sharp, wooden snap that cut through the drone of the wind. In any other household, a father might have investigated, but Lindbergh was a man of ironclad stoicism. He was a pilot who had learned to ignore the ghosts in his cockpit, a man who believed that if a machine was functioning, the noise was irrelevant. He didn't get up. He didn't check the stairs. He remained seated, immersed in his work, while just feet above his head, the ladder rail was splintering under the weight of his son's kidnapper. Why did he ignore it? Analysis of Lindbergh's character suggests an insatiable desire for control that blinded him to the unpredictable. He had built a fortress to keep the unsavory characters out, and in his mind, that fortress was impenetrable. To admit that a sound in the night was a threat was to admit a breach in his own genius. His stoic reaction wasn't a lack of love, but a fatal byproduct of his own legend. He believed he owned the environment he had created. This psychological blind spot allowed the kidnapper to descend the ladder, carry the child into the rain, and vanish into the Sourland woods. The lone eagle had been outmaneuvered in his own nest, and the snap he ignored would echo through the rest of his life as the sound of his world breaking apart. However, the greatest threat to justice that night didn't come from the kidnapper. It came from the world Lindbergh had tried so hard to escape. As soon as the word kidnapped hit the police wires, the isolation of Hopewell was annihilated. By dawn, the media invasion had begun. Reporters, photographers, and curious onlookers descended on the estate like a swarm of locusts. They didn't just cover the story, they trampled the crime scene. The muddy footprints that might have told a story of a shoe size or a gate were crushed under the boots of journalists. The area beneath the window, where microscopic traces of wood or fabric might have lingered, was turned into a churned graveyard of mud. The police were overwhelmed. At one point, there were more reporters on the property than there were investigators. Flashbulbs popped in the dark, blinding the search parties. It was a vicious irony. The very fame that had made Lindbergh a god was now the primary obstacle to finding his son. The thimble of fingerprints the technicians managed to lift were hopelessly contaminated by the mountain of people who had touched every railing and door handle. Early forensic science required a sterile environment, but Hopewell had become a circus. The press had an insatiable desire for gruesome details, and in their hunger, they destroyed the very clues that might have led to a rescue. The crime of the century was being dismantled by the story of the century before the first 24 hours had even passed. The Lindberghs were no longer parents in mourning. They were specimens under a global microscope, trapped in a fortress that had been breached by both a killer and the public. As the media circus intensified outside the stone walls of Hopewell, the investigation into the disappearance of Charles Lindbergh Jr. transformed into something surreal, a shadow dance performed across the dark landscape of 1930s America. The local police were outmatched, and the federal authorities were still finding their footing. In this vacuum of official progress, a man appeared from the periphery, someone who would become one of the most enigmatic figures in true crime history. His name was John Condon, a 72-year-old retired schoolteacher from the Bronx with a booming voice and a pathological desire to be useful. He wasn't a detective. He was a man obsessed with civic duty and, perhaps, one last moment of global significance. When Condon heard of the kidnapping, he didn't just feel sympathy. He felt a calling. He took out an advertisement in the Bronx Home News, offering himself as a go-between and even offering his own modest savings of $1,000 to be added to the ransom. It was an eccentric, almost foolish gesture, yet, to the shock of the world, the predator replied. A letter arrived at Condon's home bearing the signature of the Void, those overlapping red and blue circles with 3 punched holes. The kidnappers accepted Jafsey, a name derived from his initials JFC, as their negotiator. Suddenly, a retired teacher was the only bridge to the missing child. The first meeting was a scene straight from a vicious noir film. Woodlawn Cemetery, midnight. The fog was so thick it seemed to swallow the gravestones whole. Out of the darkness emerged a figure Condon would later call Cemetery John. They sat on a bench near a cold stone mausoleum, a teacher and a ghost, discussing the life of a baby as if they were haggling over a debt. The stranger spoke with a heavy German accent, his voice a low mechanical hiss. He didn't want to talk about the baby's health. He wanted to discuss the $50,000. Then he let slip a gruesome question. Would I be burned if the baby were dead? It was a slip of the tongue that chilled Condon to the bone, a hint that the master criminal was already standing over a grave. For weeks, Condon operated in this shadow world, moving through cemeteries and dark alleys, a man of books trying to read the mind of a predator while the police watched from the distance, powerless and dependent on a middleman whose only credential was his own obsession. While Jafsey was dancing with ghosts, the official investigation was quietly weaving an invisible net. This wasn't a trap made of steel, but of paper and clinical precision. The IRS and the newly formed FBI understood that the kidnapper's greatest weakness was his need for the money. They decided to turn the $50,000 ransom into a forensic tracking device that could never be erased. At the time, the United States was moving off the gold standard, and the government was preparing to recall all gold certificates, currency that was technically exchangeable for actual gold coin. These bills were visually distinct, featuring bright yellow seals and serial numbers that shouted from the page. Before the money was handed to Condon, federal agents meticulously recorded every single serial number. They didn't just give the kidnapper a fortune, they gave him 50,000 separate death warrants. This was a pioneering moment in the history of financial forensics. Every bank, every gas station, and every small-town grocery store was issued a vicious list of these numbers. The agents knew that no matter how clever the man believed he would eventually have to spend the money. Each bill spent would be a signal fire in the dark. It was a slow grinding method of detection, one that required an almost superhuman level of patience from the Lindbergh family. They had to sit in the silence of Hopewell, watching their wealth vanish into the underworld, hoping that the paper trail would lead them back to their son. This wasn't just an investigation. It was a forensic experiment performed under the gaze of an insatiable public. A high-stakes gamble where the currency of the realm was being used to buy a killer's identity. The deception that followed, however, was far more vicious than anyone had calculated. On April 2nd, the shadow dance reached its climax at St. Raymond's Cemetery. Condon handed over a box containing the marked gold certificates to Cemetery John. In exchange, the man provided a final note, the supposed map to the nursery. It stated that the baby was being held on a boat called the Nellie, a white schooner anchored off the coast near Martha's Vineyard. The hope that flooded the house at Hopewell was almost violent in its intensity. Charles Lindbergh, the man who had mastered the Atlantic, immediately took to the skies. He flew his own plane for hours over the gray waves, his eyes straining against the sun for a glimpse of white sails. He believed his son was just a horizon away, waves and wind finally returning what they had stolen. Back at the estate, Anne Lindbergh was in a state of psychological suspension. She prepared the nursery, she bought new clothes, and she wrote in her diary with a mother's desperate, fragile hope. But as the days passed and no schooner appeared, the truth began to reveal its gruesome face. There was no boat. There was no Nellie. The kidnapper had committed the ultimate act of cruelty. He had milked the family's desperation for $50,000 and provided a map to a ghost. The Lone Eagle was forced to land his plane on an empty shore, realizing that his fame and his fortune were worthless against a liar in a cemetery. The deception was complete, and the silence of the Sauerland Mountains became a suffocating weight once again. The end of the investigation didn't come from a brilliant lead or a forensic breakthrough. It came from a mundane moment of human biology. On May 12, 1932, a truck driver named William Allen pulled his vehicle to the side of a road just 4.5 kilometers from the Lindbergh mansion. He stepped into the woods to relieve himself, and there, beneath a layer of decaying leaves and spring debris, he saw something that would shatter the nation's heart. It was the remains of a child. The condition of the body was gruesome, a testament to the vicious nature of the elements and the act itself. The identification was immediate and agonizing. Anne Lindbergh recognized her own hand-stitched flannel suit. The metal thumb guard, designed to protect the toddler, was still fastened to the small skeletal hand. The medical examiner delivered the most devastating twist of all. Little Charlie hadn't died on a boat or in a hidden room. He had died on the very first night he was taken, March 1st. The massive fracture in his skull suggested that he had been killed almost instantly, likely during the abduction, when the amateurish ladder snapped. The shadow dance, the ransom notes, the cemetery meetings, it had all been a macabre theater performed over a shallow grave. The kidnapper had known the child was dead the entire time he was negotiating for his life. He had sold the family's hope for gold, while the eaglet lay rotting in the rain just minutes from his nursery. The hunt for a rescuer was over. The hunt for a murderer had begun, and the paper trail of gold certificates was about to start glowing in the dark. For more than 2 years, the investigation into the murder of the eaglet had been a sequence of hollow leads and mounting public frustration. The trail of marked gold certificates had gone cold, as if the $50,000 had simply evaporated into the thin air of the Depression-era underworld. But justice, much like the forensic machinery we've been discussing, often moves with a slow, grinding inevitability. The breakthrough didn't come from a high-level interrogation or a dramatic shootout. It came from a mundane transaction at a gas station in Upper Manhattan on September 15th, 1934. A dark blue Dodge sedan pulled up to a Warner Quinlan service station. The driver, a man with a sharp, angular face and a thick accent, asked for 5 gallons of gas. When it came time to pay the 98-cent bill, he handed the attendant, Walter Lyle, a $10 gold certificate. In 1934, gold certificates were more than just rare. They were technically illegal to possess under the new federal laws. Lyle, suspicious that the bill might be counterfeit or part of a recent bank heist, did something that changed the course of history. He took a pencil and scrawled the driver's license plate number onto the margin of the bill, 4U-13-41. 3 days later, a bank teller recognized the serial number from the vicious list issued by the FBI. The plate led authorities directly to 1277 East 222nd Street in the Bronx. The man behind the wheel was Bruno Richard Hauptmann, a 34-year-old German immigrant and carpenter. When the police closed in, they found more than just a suspect. Inside Hauptmann's garage, hidden behind a loose board and buried in cans of oil, was nearly $14,000 of the Lindbergh ransom money. To the police, the case was open and shut. They had the man, they had the car, and they had the money. But Hauptmann remained stoic, offering a clinical, almost detached denial that echoed the coldness of the crime itself. He claimed the money belonged to a deceased business partner named Isidore Fish. It was a weak alibi that would soon be dismantled by a piece of evidence that could not lie: a piece of wood. If the gas station transaction provided the who, then the forensic science of xylotomy, the study of wood, provided the how. This is where our story shifts from a standard police procedural into a groundbreaking educational documentary. To convict Hauptmann, the prosecution needed more than just possession of the money. They needed to link him directly to the nursery window in Hopewell. They turned to Arthur Kohler, a wood expert from the U.S. Forest Service. Kohler's investigation was a masterclass in microscopic detection, a precursor to the advanced DNA analysis we use today. He took the abandoned, broken ladder found at the crime scene and began to read it like a biological map. Kohler focused on one specific part of the ladder, rail 16. He noticed that the wood, North Carolina pine, had very specific growth rings and 4 distinct nail holes. He spent months scouring lumber yards across the East Coast, tracking the mechanical fingerprints left by the specific saws and planes that had processed the wood. His search eventually led him to Hauptmann's own home. In a moment of forensic brilliance, Kohler climbed into the suspect's attic. He found a section of the floorboard that had been sawn away. When he placed rail 16 of the kidnapping ladder into the gap, the growth rings matched perfectly. They were as unique as a human thumbprint. The nail holes in the ladder rail even lined up with the joists in Hauptmann's attic. This was the talking wood? Kohler proved with scientific certainty that the ladder used to climb into the Lindbergh nursery had been constructed using materials taken from the very floor Hauptmann walked on every day. Even the hand plane found in Hauptmann's tool chest left microscopic grooves on the ladder's surface that matched perfectly with test shaves. This wasn't just circumstantial evidence. It was a physical bridge connecting the Bronx carpenter to the broken window in New Jersey. The insatiable desire for a perfect crime had been defeated by the oldest witness in the world. the cellular structure of a pine tree. The trial that followed in Flemington, New Jersey in January 1935 was a vicious media circus that the modern world would find unrecognizable. An estimated 700 reporters and 130 photographers descended on the small town. The atmosphere was thick with an insatiable desire for blood. Charles Lindbergh himself sat in the courtroom every day, his presence a silent, heavy weight on the proceedings. To the public, this wasn't just a trial of a man, it was a trial of a monster who had dared to touch the real-life Superman. Hauptmann, however, remained an enigma. He sat through the gruesome testimony with a cold, almost arrogant detachment, occasionally smirking at the prosecutors. The prosecution's case was a relentless hammer. They presented the wood evidence, the ransom money, and the testimony of John Condon, who identified Hauptmann as the man he met in the cemetery. But the defense attempted a counter-argument that tapped into the populist fears of the time. They painted Hauptmann as a scapegoat, a victim of a police force desperate to give the world's hero a head on a platter. They leaned heavily on the Isidor Fish alibi, claiming the dead man had left the money in Hauptmann's care. But it was a narrative that could not withstand the clinical precision of the forensic facts. The most dramatic moment came when Hauptmann took the stand in his own defense. He was grilled for over 11 hours. The prosecutor, David Willents, used a vicious and aggressive style, calling Hauptmann a predator and a liar to his face. The public's hunger for retribution was palpable. Outside the courthouse, vendors sold miniature ransom ladders as souvenirs. The jury, after 32 days of testimony and only 11 hours of deliberation, returned a verdict of guilty. Hauptmann was sentenced to death. Despite multiple appeals and a last-minute offer of life imprisonment if he would confess and name his accomplices, Hauptmann refused. He maintained his innocence until the very end, a stoicism that some viewed as a sign of a vicious heart, and others as the terrifying possibility of a wrongful conviction. The legacy of the Lindbergh case extends far beyond the execution of Bruno Richard Hauptmann on April 3, 1936. His death in the electric chair, known as Old Smoky, was the final act in a tragedy that had changed the American landscape forever. While the man was gone, the vicious nature of the crime had forced a fundamental shift in the law. Before 1932, kidnapping was largely a state-level offense, often resulting in jurisdictional chaos that allowed predators to slip through the cracks. In response to the national outcry, Congress passed the Federal Kidnapping Act, more commonly known as the Lindbergh Law. This law made kidnapping a federal crime if the victim was transported across state lines, allowing the full weight of the FBI to be brought to bear on such cases. It also established the death penalty for kidnappings that resulted in the death of the victim. The case had transformed the FBI from a minor agency into a national powerhouse of forensic investigation. Yet, even with the execution and the new laws, the case remains shrouded in unanswered questions. Was Hauptmann truly a lone wolf? Could a single man have orchestrated such a complex shadow dance while maintaining a normal life in the Bronx? The forensic ladder and the gold certificates had provided a conviction, but they couldn't provide closure. The public's insatiable desire for a simple narrative of good versus evil was met instead with a complex reality of forensic brilliance and lingering doubt. Charles Lindbergh had his justice, but at a gruesome cost. He had become the catalyst for a new era of American law, but he remained a man haunted by the silence of the nursery. The carpenter was gone, the law was changed, but the vicious shadow of March 1st would never truly leave the Lindbergh estate. The tragedy of March 1st didn't end with the death of a child or the execution of a carpenter. It lived on, a vicious and invisible parasite that attached itself to the very DNA of the Lindbergh family. Charles and Anne went on to have 5 more children: John, Land, Anne, Scott, and Reeve. To the outside world, they were the resilient heirs of an American dynasty. But inside the walls of their various estates, they were the silent heirs, subjects of a social experiment driven by their father's pathological need for control and security. Charles Lindbergh, the man who had mastered the infinite Atlantic, had been fundamentally broken by the breach of his Hopewell fortress. He spent the rest of his life ensuring it would never happen again. But the price of that security was the childhood of his children. They were raised in a clinical atmosphere of total isolation. The press was the enemy, the public was a predator, and privacy was the only religion allowed in the household. The children were forbidden from speaking to strangers. They were moved from house to house, from Connecticut to England to France, always searching for a horizon that wasn't crowded with flashbulbs. Charles was not just a father, he was a commander. He ran his household with the same mechanical precision he used to pilot the Spirit of St. Louis. Every meal was timed. Every activity was evaluated for its character-building potential. He was a strict disciplinarian who valued stoicism above all else, often appearing cold and distant to the children who were desperate for a glimpse of the hero the world worshipped. The trauma of 1932 was never discussed. It was the gruesome ghost that sat at every dinner table but remained unnamed. The children grew up knowing they were different, knowing they were hunted, but never fully understanding the man who led the hunt for their own privacy. This environment produced adults who were brilliant, but deeply guarded. John became an oceanographer, disappearing into the depths of the sea. Land became a rancher in the remote corners of Montana. Scott sought refuge in the study of primates in France. They all sought the same thing their father had, a place where the world couldn't find them. This cycle of inherited trauma created a family of islands, each connected by blood, but separated by a vicious ironclad silence. It was a golden cage of fame, where the bars were made of history, and the lock was turned by a father who could never forgive the world for what it took from him. While the American Lindberghs were living in their fortress of silence, Charles Lindbergh was building a second world, a shadow empire of affection and deception that would not be revealed for nearly half a century. Beginning in 1957, the man who famously valued integrity and truth began a double life that shatters the one-dimensional image of the American hero. During his frequent business trips to Europe as a consultant for Pan Am, Lindbergh wasn't just attending meetings. He was playing the role of a father to 3 separate families in Germany and Switzerland. He used the alias Carew Kent, a name that sounded mundane enough to avoid suspicion, yet allowed him to navigate the world as a ghost once again. His primary secret partner was Brigitte Heschheimer, a talented hat maker in Munich. With her, he had 3 children. But the deception did not stop there. In a twist that is almost too vicious to believe, he also maintained a relationship with Brigitte's sister Marietta, with whom he had 2 more children. And in yet another layer of this secret empire, He had 2 additional children with his private secretary in Europe, Valeska. For 15 years, Charles Lindbergh managed to maintain 4 separate families across 2 continents. He was a master of logistics, calculating his travel schedules with the same insatiable desire for precision that had once conquered the Atlantic. To his German children, he wasn't the lone eagle or a global icon. He was Uncle Caro, a mysterious but warm man who would appear for a few days, tell stories of his travels, and then vanish back into the sky. The clinical audacity required to maintain this lie is staggering. He wrote letters to all his families, carefully managing the data of his life so that no one world ever bled into the other. He provided for them financially, but he denied them the most basic truth of their own identities. He was a predator of his own legacy, hiding his human flaws behind a mask of high-altitude stoicism. Why did he do it? Perhaps the golden cage of his American life was too heavy. In Europe, as Caro Kent, he could be a man, not a monument. He could experience the simple joys of a nursery without the crushing weight of the Hopewell tragedy. But in seeking this second chance at fatherhood, he committed a final gruesome betrayal against everyone who loved him. He was a man who owned the sky, but could never find a home in the truth. For 3 decades after Charles Lindbergh's death in 1974, his legacy remained a marble monument. But in 2003, the marble began to crack. The truth surfaced not through a forensic search or a police investigation, but through the persistent curiosity of his secret children. Astrid Borth, one of Brigitte Heschheimer's daughters, had grown up with a trunk full of letters from the man she knew as Uncle Caro. After her mother's death, she began to notice the undeniable similarities, the handwriting, the specific phrasing, the dates of the visits. She reached out to the Lindbergh family in America, triggering a DNA reckoning that would change history. The results were a clinical match. The lone eagle was indeed the father of 7 children in Europe. The moment the American Lindberghs met their European siblings was a collision of 2 separate realities. For Reeve Lindbergh, the youngest of the American children, it was a shock that felt like a secondary kidnapping, a theft of the father she thought she knew. She had spent her life defending his privacy, only to find that he had used that privacy to hide an entire lifetime of betrayal. The shock of the betrayal was vicious and deep. The hero who had demanded absolute honesty and discipline from his American heirs had spent his life as a master of deception. Yet, as the 2 families began to speak, something remarkable happened. They didn't retreat into anger. Instead, they began to compare their notes on the man who had shaped them. This was the final forensic analysis of Charles Lindbergh. They discovered that they were all pieces of a puzzle he had never intended for them to solve. The public icon was shattered, replaced by a complex, flawed, and deeply secretive man. This reveal was the final twist in the Lindbergh story. It took the case beyond the murder of a child and into the realm of human psychology and the devastating power of secrets. The DNA reckoning proved that while a carpenter could be executed and a law could be passed, the truth of a human soul is the only thing that can never be truly buried. How do we reconcile these 2 men? On one side of the Atlantic, we have the strict disciplinarian, a father who was so haunted by the death of his first son that he became a warden to his remaining heirs. This Charles Lindbergh was a man of iron and ice, a pilot who navigated his family life with a clinical coldness that left his children feeling like specimens in a lab. He was the hero who could master the wind, but couldn't hug his own daughter without an agenda. On the other side, in the modest homes of Munich and Zurich, we have Caro Kent, the warm uncle. This man was reportedly affectionate, playful, and present. He was the man who made pancakes for his secret children and told them stories of the world's wonders. This psychological deconstruction reveals the ultimate anomaly of Lindbergh's life. It suggests that he was a man who could only handle the insatiable desire for love if it was kept in a vacuum, safe from the scrutiny of the world. He was a man who had been so traumatized by the media invasion of 1932 that he felt he could only be truly himself if he were a ghost. The two fathers were not different people. They were two different reactions to the same gruesome fame. The American father was a reaction to fear. The German father was a quest for a lost innocence. In the end, Charles Lindbergh was the ultimate predator of his own identity. He navigated his life with the same periscope he used in the spirit of St. Louis, seeing only what he wanted to see while the world around him remained a blur. He was a man who sought to be a god, but was dismantled by the very human need for connection and the very human capacity for deceit. As we look back at the case files, we realize that the ladder that broke in 1932 didn't just kill a child. It fractured the soul of a hero, creating a man who would spend the next 40 years trying to fly away from himself. The Lindbergh legacy is not one of flight and glory. It is a story of a vicious silence and the 7 secret lives that finally broke it. The lone eagle was never really alone. He was just hiding in plain sight, waiting for the truth to finally catch up to him at the end of the runway. The saga of Charles Lindbergh is a chilling testament to the fragile nature of the human spirit. It serves as a permanent warning that intellect, when severed from the anchor of morality and empathy, becomes a weapon of self-annihilation. The man who mastered the heavens was ultimately dismantled by a singular mundane oversight, a broken ladder, and a slip of paper. But the true vicious tragedy lies deeper than the forensic evidence. It lies in the fragile mask of a hero who spent 40 years flying away from his own reality. Was Bruno Richard Hauptmann truly a lone wolf, or was he merely a pawn in a larger, darker game? We may never know for certain. What we do know is that Lindbergh's insatiable desire for absolute control created a golden cage that trapped everyone he loved. From the silent heirs in America to the secret families in Germany, the lone eagle remained fundamentally alone, even when surrounded by the echoes of his 2 lives. The Lindbergh case files are closed, but the shadow of that night in 1932 still lingers. It forces us to ask a final haunting question. In our own pursuit of greatness, what parts of our humanity are we willing to sacrifice? Perhaps the most gruesome truth of all is that the fortress we build to keep the world out is often the very place where we lose ourselves. Thank you for joining us on this investigation. Was Charles Lindbergh a victim of his fame, or the architect of his own misery? We'd love to read your theories in the comments below. Until next time.